Afternoon, everyone. My name is Hunter. As we just mentioned, I am an international development consultant at Stantec. I will be talking about our reports collaborated with China Chamber of Commerce and EU SME Center. I would like to first introduce the agenda. So I'll be going over a bit about the Chinese labor markets, then talk a bit about the laws and regulations here in China, move on to the key components within the human resource management, and last but not least, giving us a outlook for SMEs for future endeavors. So what we began with the report was we looked into one of the key components that drives the labor industry, that is the China's education attainments. Now, of course, we understand that China as a nation has gone through rapid economic development over the past few decades, or let's say the past decades. And it is no surprise that the education level of the population has increased by such a bit. However, many of the times when we're reading the news articles, the headlines may be a bit misleading. If we do zoom out the bigger picture and look at the nation as a whole, and if we can direct our attention to the right graph over here, we can see that compared to a lot of European countries, Germany, France, Italy, for example, China still falls short on the tertiary and secondary education.
Another thing we've looked at was a topic among the very hot discussion is the unemployment overview. As most of us have recognized that over the past few years, due to the pandemic, the unemployment rate it's not been always stable, but so far coming to 2024, which this graph does not show just yet, the unemployment rate of the entire population is bouncing around the 5% range, which is fairly stable considering the economic instability around the world. However, it is the youth unemployment rates, hinting the population aged between 16 and 24. This is where it becomes interesting. So the government have actually stopped releasing data on the youth unemployment rates starting from June 2023. And just prior to the halt of releasing the figures, it has reached a record high of over 20%. Now, this is mostly driven by factors such as, China is transitioning from a primary secondary industry to a tertiary sector-driven country. The COVID pandemic does hamper the job recovery process. It is limiting the budget from both the government spending as well as corporate budgets on hiring and planning for future activities. Economic instability does play a part of us as well. And last but not least, it is the new wave of new graduates, which have reached a record high in recent years. So it is expected that, or should I say, many experts have predicted that the youth unemployment rate is going to continue to rise in the years to come. But this is also, as the SME business owner, an opportunity for you to capitalize. So before diving into the bits and pieces of human resource management, we first like to introduce a bit of an overview of the Chinese labor laws and regulation landscape. And unlike many of the European nations, I would say that's some of the questions, the toughest question that our clients face the most is, how do we navigate around different layers of regulations? Over here on the left side, I have listed a list of national level provisions, which is mostly applicable for you SMEs. But please keep in mind that understanding, even if you do understand 100% of the time of what those provisions are, you will still need a certain work to be able to come up with an efficient human resource strategy. And the reason why I say that is if we direct attention to the right-hand graph, the China's labor laws and regulation is comprised of different layers approach. We have a top framework and provisions, which is the national level provisions. And over here, we can see there are 6 components. There's the trade union law, social insurance law, labor dispute, mediation, arbitration, international labor convention in the case of hiring foreigners, and last but not least, the ones that we're most familiar with, labor contract law and labor law. However, underneath those can mostly be seen as the framework laid out by the government to tell regional governments what you have to do to come up with your own regulations. And from there, for the next layer, the regional governments are required to come up with their own set of regulations. So anything to do with, we do have a list of here, so economic compensation, non-competition clauses, employee benefits, overtime pay calculation, and even for labor disputes, each and every single region will have a very different approach to all of these areas. And of course, those areas are not the only ones that's going to be different, but we just picked it out as those are the main areas that businesses have problems dealing with. The labor law and contract law component is made up of a variety of subcomponents. Businesses often have a hard time of grasping what is important, what should they do first, and which area should be paying the particular attention to. What we have seen over the past few years from our auditing experience, from our supply chain services, is that there are 8 components that businesses should pay particular attention to, and those are labor contract, working hours, wages, training, health and safety, all the way to labor protection. So for labor contract, which I'll be discussing in just a bit, it does cover pretty much everything. Working hours does correlate with wages, so telling the employees how much they have to work, what is the minimum wage, and how does the wage is being calculated. For employee benefits, this refers to mostly the vacational leaves, as well as the 5 insurances and 1 housing fund, which we'll be discussing just a bit. Vocational skills training, this mostly applies for the blue-collar workers, as well as the occupational health and safety. So working within a hazardous environment, for example, what kind of procedures and safety protocols would have to be implemented to ensure an adequate approach to the workplace. And last but not least, labor protection. In the case of labor disputes between employees and employers, what's going to happen, and so on and so forth. So the 5 social insurance and one housing fund. This is a common topic that we've had plenty of discussion with so many of our clients, and this is also referred to as the 五险一金 in Chinese. Many of you have heard of it, and the bigger question we get asked the most is how to exactly calculate this. And if we were to take a deeper look at this, it is not essentially the level of difficulty of calculation. Is more so of understanding how does that apply to each individual, each employee. So for the 5 insurance, that refers to the pension fund, medical, unemployment, maternity, as well as work injury. And for the housing fund, it is the housing provident fund. The calculation is quite simple. Each region, most of the time, would have a percentage that would have to be paid by the employer as well as the employees. Over here, for example, the pension, the employers normally pay between 12% to 22%, multiplying by the contribution base. The employee would have to pay 8%, so a bit of a lesser amount. But what's most interesting is the contribution base. Most of you have, I don't think, if you're not HR person, you've not heard of it. It is a measure of an employee's, let's say, performance, and how it is related, how it's calculated. It is the equivalent of the same month salary from the previous year. So let's say I'm making 10,000 RMB this month, and I was making 9,000 RMB in the March of 2022. So that's going to be calculated. So the contribution base of my salary for this month is going to be 9,000 RMB. There is also a maximum and a minimum threshold imposed by many regional governments. Most of the time, it is between the 60% to the 300% of the region's monthly average wage. And the reason why I brought this up is that we have seen so many cases, and whether it's retail industry, apparel industry, so many of the factories have kind of exploited the loophole. There is always a lack of supervision within the government, and government's not going to pay every single detail to let's say the contribution base. So what those companies have done was that instead of using the contribution base for each employee, which should be unique to their own, they have actually adopted the minimum regional contribution base across its entire workforce. This is extremely hard to notice for the supervision entities, and also if the employees are unfamiliar with this matter, they will not recognize. This is definitely not recommended, and should this be taken to court, the company will definitely be facing with a hefty fine. In the case of foreign workers, there is a bit of let's say beneficiary to that. The foreign workers do have to pay the 5 insurance in full, but they will be exempted from paying the housing fund. However, if you are, or if your employee is a part of the nation of Luxembourg, Serbia, Spain, Netherlands, Switzerland, Finland, and Denmark, those are the European countries, by the way, only, then they will be exempted from paying further insurance, depending on the convention that is signed between both countries' governments. Taking Denmark, for example, I believe as of March 2024, sorry, that's a mistake. Danish nationals are exempted from paying the pension and as well as the housing provident funds from this employment. So that's good to know. If you have not done so already, if you've not checked the convention, feel free to do so for you or your employees. And so moving on to labor types. There are a variety of labor types stipulated in the labor and the labor contract law in China. We'll be mostly focusing on the 4 types of labor: direct, dispatched and outsourced labor and internships, which I think is the most prevalent for the EU SMEs at this stage. So for the direct labor, it is the most simple, common type of employment. The employer just sign a labor contract with the employee. It does pay the salary as well as the social insurance, housing funds, and also the employer is responsible for managing the employee day to day. When it comes to dispatched and outsourced labor, that's when it becomes a more interesting facet. Both sides would involve a third-party agency. This agency does offer a HR service. So for the dispatch labor, what's happening between the company and the employee is that the employer does not have any legal relation with the employee, but rather the employee would sign a labor contract with the labor dispatch agency. The labor dispatch agency would then send the worker over to the employer for any task and work allocation. When it comes to outsourced labor, however, most of the time, and interesting enough, the employer, the company will not actually get a chance to see the employee. And this may happen in cases of construction workers, IT personnel, and customer service. So those are the three main components that is the most popular in China. What they've done is the company, the employer, would come to a labor outsource agency, tell them what their need is, what kind of personnel they would require, and from there, that's all the communication. From there, it's the agency's job to find the right personnel and to allocate the work directly for the workers. The workers will provide the input, and then the agency would be responsible for transferring the work output onto towards the employer. And last but not least, the internships. And we get asked this question a lot, like, are interns, what kind of contract should we sign with interns? Are they, are we obligated to pay them, let's say, a minimum wage, or is there a certain standard? The answer is no. To put it into simple terms, hiring interns is actually not bounded by the labor or the labor contract law. Interns, just because interns are not categorized as a type of labor force, if I was to say, by the labor laws. In fact, if you were to hire an intern, it is recommended that you sign a contract, a working contract, and this working contract is going to be bounded by the contract law from China. And of course, you're encouraged to sign this just in case of any labor disputes or any legal disputes between you or the intern. So yes, you will not be initiating any labor relations, nor would you have to pay any salary or insurances. You just have to manage the intern from day-to-day activities. Yeah. Labor termination. This is also a topic that we find most interesting to many of our clients. The most two common labor terminations is always it's either by termination by employer, that is termination without the fault of the employee, or it's termination by employee via voluntary termination. And what's most interesting is that many clients have also come to us and asked, there's a form of, as an employer, there's the option of terminating an employee by employee negligence. And if you do this, the employers would not bear any cost. They will not have to give any prior notices. They will not have to give compensation to the employee. So why can we not use this form of termination, which, speaking aside of any ethical issues, just from the cost side, why can't they do it? Now, the biggest question is, once the process is initiated by termination by employee negligence or termination by employer negligence, most of the time, the counterparty would like to take this case into court. And sadly enough, the majority of the time, the court does favor the individual, so the employee. And even if the court decides to rule out for the employer, there's still going to be ample evidence to be prepared from the employer side, as well as the time and cost, as well as the legal power to proceed with such actions. The third type of termination is termination upon agreed conditions. This is what happens when both the employer and the employee agree within the labor contract, saying that, for example, once this project is completed or once the state reached, we will no longer have a labor relation. So this is going to be more of the simpler side. Regarding the termination by employer, termination by employee, there are 6 main steps that we've outlined that we think should be more of a procedural takeaway for each business. That is, depending on the scenario, first, either the employer will have to notify the trade union, or the employee have to notify the employer in advance, depending on the local regulations, normally 30 days. the work handover process initiated by the employer, salary settlements, coming to an automatic termination of the employment contract, issuance of the dismissal certificate, and last but not least, record keeping. When we are examining a lot of factories from time to time, one of the questions that was asked a lot as well is that how can such a standardized operation, business how can a business within a standardized industry stand out from each other? Apart from paying additional salaries to the employees, apart from giving them more physical benefits, what else can we offer? And oftentimes the answer goes to the simple term is that, in order to take care of the employees, you have to really understand what they need as well as, what they want in the future. So we've over here outlined two procedures that we think could be easily implemented by every single business, which also be helpful for both the business and as well as the employee. The first one is a training framework. Most of the time when we see factories, especially factories, companies, they before onboarding a new employee, they will go through just a really quick round of training, more of a procedure training, and then the employee is set on the job and it's ready to go. However, what we do recommend is to go through a 3-leveled approach to the training. First, you have to have a company-level training. This does provide the company vision, telling the employee what the company is about, the operation, so on and so forth. Moving on to the department training as well as the team training. So those are more focused towards the safety protocols, as well as health and safety preventions. And of course, we're talking about the cases of blue-collar workers. In the case of white-collar workers, of course, you may not recognize the need for a departmental level training, but it is also strongly recommended that you do have a 2-layered approach of a company level training, introducing the employee to the company vision, what is your business scope, and last but not least to the team level training. Moving on to the grievance management mechanism, this is something that does not get talked about a lot, especially in China with such a hierarchical workplace approach. And by grievance management, we mean that should an employee have any suggestions or concerns related to workplace questions or have any personal questions, they themselves would have an adequate channel to communicate to the upper management, telling them what they really need. Now, of course, companies can come to me and say that, okay, managers can also ask employees on the day, how's it going? Do they have any questions, so on and so forth? But again, to ensure an adequate as well as a free from retaliation approach, it is recommended that companies should develop a multiple communication channel from the employee all the way to the top management, addressing any potential questions and also preventing the employee of having any concerns about potential retaliations from the management or the company. Looking ahead, the general atmosphere, many have argued that it is not too great. Challenges such as increasing labor costs, which I believe is going to be staying here for quite a while, IP theft, poor employee management, as well as the unfamiliarity to the Chinese markets is all going to stay. However, looking on the bright side, as EU SMEs, as a foreign-owned enterprise, there is always this favorable option for many of the Chinese population to go for. Foreign-owned entities have been widely known for its really great employee benefit as well as employee treatment, workplace culture. So if you were to leverage your human resource management system correctly, you'll be able to capitalize on the oversupply of candidates, especially from the high youth unemployment rate so far. We may see, and this is a highly likely chance of government incentives to support EU, especially small to medium enterprises, of attracting talents as well as providing any financial support regarding constructing the factory, for example, relocating, etc., and therefore achieving overall a sustainable workforce through management. And so before ending the presentation, I want to say that if there are one thing that most companies have ignored, and which I don't blame them for it, is oftentimes we see a lot of European companies, they send management from let's say Europe to China and adopt a management strategy that was suitable for them in their own country, however, does not really apply to the case in the Chinese workplace. This is because of the high degree of variance across the culture. Over here on the left graph, we can see three metrics. Those three metrics are taken from a framework called the Hofstad framework. Essentially, it is a tool used to measure a difference in individual behavior as well as cultural preferences in terms of the workplace. And of course, there are different metrics. We picked power distance, individualism, and the long-term orientation to provide a clearer picture. And we can see that, all three indicators, within the Chinese population, there's a very different approach. Power distance, hinting the level of hierarchy within the workplace, is scored very high in the Chinese workforce. On the other hand, for individualism, is scored really low. So more often the times, the emphasis of teamwork and collaboration and elevating the company value rather than your individual value is emphasized across a lot of workplace. And last but not least, Chinese professionals has often been viewed as a very long-term orientator, as we can see, scoring very high on long-term orientation. Those indicators that are very different from many of the European countries would play a huge part in communication, work-life balance, and workplace hierarchy. So those are the three main categories that we think SMEs should also pay attention to when it comes to especially getting on board with new employee, getting them familiar with the company culture, and so on. So that does sum up the presentation as well as the reports. Of course, the report does provide more of an in-depth overview. This is a presentation which hopefully was able to summarize the report for quite a bit, but feel free to download the report, which is collaborated and published with the EU SME Center and the China Italy Chamber of Commerce. And thank you for your time.